Hello, it's Adam in the studio, and in a moment we'll focus on what's going on between the US and Iran. And later on in the episode, we'll be catching up with Faisal Islam because Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, did a statement in Parliament at lunchtime on Tuesday talking about the government's thoughts about economic support in the face of the market turmoil and increasing energy bills as a result of the conflict in the Middle East. But first of all, what is going on with these negotiations between the US and Iran? I was confused listening to yesterday's newscast. Let's see if I become less confused when we talk about it now, because here to help me work out what's going on in the newscast studio is Lyse Doucet. Hello, Lyse.
Good to join you, Adam. It's a bit worrying that when I join you too often.
Well, I mean, it's still nice to see. It's always nice to see you on a personal level.
It is nice. And it is really nice to be here with our other guests.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, that's Parham Ghobadi, a senior reporter from BBC Persian. Hello, Parham. Welcome
Hi.
to Newscast.
I'm really happy to be here with you guys.
I mean, working on the BBC's Persian service in the last couple of weeks, what's it been like?
Hectic, really hectic. So I remember the first day that the war broke out, I was on air for 24 hours.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Even Lisa's impressed by that.
No. Because I watch on we have this, okay, like everyone around the world, everyone has WhatsApp groups. And people like you and others don't go to sleep because and sometimes I feel guilty. I'll go to bed early in the morning and I think I can't do anymore. And then I'll wake up then in the morning and I'll look and I'll think, well, they didn't go to bed. But seriously, I mean, obviously it's of huge personal and professional interest to you, and everyone here, including you, have been working night and day.
Yeah. Sometimes waking up for, I think, 10, 12 days. We were waking up 2 in the morning, and then I was here at MBH 4 a.m. and then I was on air at 5:30 and then throughout the day. So it was.
And what are the most reliable sources for finding out what's actually happening on the ground in Iran? Because I feel the actual kind of the physical reporting of the conflict doesn't exist in this war as it has done for others.
It is becoming more and more difficult on a daily basis. So because of the internet, blackout, it's become extremely difficult. There are for example, some people send us directly videos. That's part of our material. But also there are some Telegram channels, like a really reliable one called Vahid Online. Oh. But even he's getting less and less and less videos. So these days we see that he's just posting a picture or two, or maybe 1 or 2 footage from inside the country. And the reason for that is that they are arresting, like today they said that they arrested almost 500 people, those who they believe they sent material to foreign channels and foreign sources, like Vahid Online, like us, like other Persian channels. So they're tracked. So the new crackdown is a digital crackdown in Iran.
And we'll talk a bit more about what's happening in Iran in a second. But Lyse, I just wanted to catch up with what we were discussing on Newscast yesterday, which is these, I don't want to call them negotiations because it doesn't sound like there's any negotiating happening. What is actually going on in terms of communications between Iran and the US, which some people in the White House are calling negotiations?
Well, President Trump always speaks in a very bombastic language, whether he's talking about war or talking about peace. And there's often a bit of truth in them. And that may sound disrespectful, but I think he also uses this as a tactic, because it's being widely said that his announcement that, in his words, very strong talks are taking place with Iran now, and that they're going to lead to a total and complete resolution of hostilities in the Middle East, and that brought him back from a very dangerous brink. I mean, to remind our listeners, he had given Iran 48 hours to open up that critical waterway, having an impact on all of our lives, the Strait of Hormuz, or he would then destroy Iran's power plants and energy infrastructure. So just when the clock was ticking down, he suddenly announced that there had been this breakthrough, and predictably, the oil prices went down, the stock market went up, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and there are multiple reports that there was insider trading as well. Those accusations have to be proven, but there was a huge increase in the volume of trading. And so President Trump has to be mindful of this growing pressure on him to find a way out of this war. As for very strong talks, it'll be interesting what Parham sees. It seems to me that there are 2 windows, and the 2 windows have opened by a little crack. So it's not, he gives this impression the door has opened to diplomacy. I don't think the door has opened. One of the windows is the window which has already been shattered twice, and that is when Iran's lead negotiator, the Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, has been speaking to the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, and we understand that there have been communications between them on telephone, text messages, but there is so little trust in that process because both times they talked before, June last year, February this year, the process was shattered by another outbreak of war, Israeli attacks backed by the United States. So there's no trust there. The second door, and we can discuss about the second window which has been opened, is President Trump is also saying that he's talking to a top official. He said, I can't tell you who it is because he might be killed. Well, Israeli media came out and said who they believe this top official is. And it's mentioned that it's Mohammed Bagher Ghalibaf, who is the Speaker of Parliament, although the Parliament is not meeting now, obviously. A man of the system who's played key roles, including being head of the Air Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, being the police chief, also the mayor of Tehran. He's regarded as a hardliner who, to use an expression someone used to me today, that maybe more ideologically flexible. In other words, President Trump
So
is
he's a
hoping
hardliner and pragmatic at
he
the same
could be.
time.
Well, sometimes he's got a checkered history. Sometimes he's ran 4 times for president and never won, and sometimes he's a moderate and sometimes he's a hardliner. So he does seem flexible. But to finish my comment, President Trump keeps looking for a Delcy Rodriguez. In other words, an Iranian version of the Venezuelan vice president, who then became president once Nicolas Maduro was extracted by American military action. And of course, this betrayed, and since then, President Trump's administration has worked with her, a powerful player who's also a pragmatist, who has been willing to a certain extent to bend to President Trump's will. But it betrayed a fundamental misunderstanding of the differences between Iran and Venezuela. You just can't choose one person and expect them to be able to go along with what you say, especially not Iran.
So we think there is a channel of communications open between the foreign minister of Iran and Steve Witkoff.
Preliminary.
Yeah.
Yes, very, about talks, de-escalation, don't hit energy infrastructure, very, very limited. I don't know what Parham
And then on the second thing then, Parham, what do we think is actually happening with Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament?
So the most important thing, as you mentioned, is that there's this lack of trust that has become way more, it has deteriorated over the past 2 conflicts, that Iranians say that we were in the midst of negotiations and we were attacked both times. So there is this lack of...
because there have been 3 rounds of negotiations in Geneva.
Exactly.
Last
But
time.
apart from that lack of trust, Iranians are right now saying that all of these officials are saying that we're not going to finish this war because we want to make sure that we are not going to be attacked like the past 2 times. And from their perspective, they are winning somehow because they've managed to block the Strait of Hormuz. The oil prices have gone up. They are managing to hit Israel almost on a daily basis, and their missiles are targeting places here and there. They're attacking all the military bases around, U.S. bases around in the region. So from their perspective, they are not losing this war. They're being attacked, of course, but they have some leverage right now, and they want to use that leverage. But how? But there's this risk for them that this might backfire at some point, because blocking the Strait of Hormuz and all these things that they're doing, it might backfire. And Trump is it's unpredictable. You don't know what his next move is. Is he going to attack Iranian infrastructure? Because that will not only damage the Islamic Republic, it will damage Iran as a whole and the future of millions of people. So the strategy, and what if, for example, Donald Trump decides to bring Marines in, the 5,000 Marines that they transferred from Japan? What if they're going to occupy Khark Island? And for example, that is where 95% of Iranian oil export is from that terminal, or South Pars refinery, that over 50% of Iranian gas export is from there. If that is damaged, that is Iran's lifeline, and that can cripple the Iranian economy.
Yeah, interesting. Just seeing sort of the stakes from the Iranian point of view.
And so Parham's outlined what some of the other scenarios are, which has underlined why Iran is still suspicious. And the response from the foreign ministry about all these talks. First of all, the Iranian foreign ministry and other officials have absolutely denied that any negotiations, talks are taking place, but that there have been initiatives from friendly countries. And we know that Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey, who have not been on the front line militarily of this this war have now been more actively involved in sending messages between the two sides. But the statements from the Iranian foreign minister also say that they see this as just President Trump, as I mentioned, trying to bring down stock prices, but also trying to distract Iran from the military buildup, because there still is quite a few days before these thousands of Marines arrive in the theater. There's also talk of possible even ground troops being used. And so you need time. And so President Trump has to find a way to deal with the markets, to deal with the political pressures while the preparations for another escalation take place.
You mentioned Pakistan. I mean, you read some news websites and it sounds like Pakistan is setting up the negotiating table, getting the flags out and arranging some kind of peace conference. But I'm guessing that's actually not what is happening.
Pakistan wants to be seen to be helpful. Pakistan's military and political leaders have really cultivated their ties with President Trump. They're very close. They have also, like Turkey and other Islamic countries, have joined this expanded Arab Ministers Forum to try to deal with the Gulf crisis. So they want to play a more pivotal role. So it was announced. It seems unbelievable to me that J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, would fly into Pakistan and would meet this pragmatist, hardline pragmatist, however you want to describe Mohammed Ghalibaf, in Pakistan this weekend, which to me right now seems fanciful. You know, maybe somewhere down the line when they're not at war, when the gaps are not so wide, but they're nowhere near that. There's a lot more diplomacy that has to be done. But that was the report. And just before I joined you, there were reports in Pakistani media that Mohammed Ghalibaf had already arrived. And so there's a swirl of speculation, and our correspondent in Pakistan is talking to people who are monitoring the flights, like the plane spotters, talking to other sources to see whether anyone's arriving from Iran.
But Parham, the idea of face-to-face talks between the Americans and the Iranians in Pakistan would be so different from any of the diplomacy between the US and Iran for the last 40 years.
That's correct. And that will dismay many Iranian protesters and those who oppose the regime. Today, we just received a video, Vahid Online published it, that we could hear Iran's anti-air defense system and the sound of bombardment in the background. And some people were chanting, "Long live the king," referring to the Iranian prince in exile, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah of Iran. So now those people and Iranian protesters, they would be really dismayed to see any kind of negotiation between the United States and the Islamic Republic. And the reason for that is, and all the signs show that if this regime stays in place after this war, we are going to have a more belligerent and hostile regime that feels strong, that can have a sway even over the most powerful military in the world and the most advanced military in the Middle East. It has a say and it has some strength. And let's not forget, all of this war is happening just 2 months after thousands of Iranian protesters were killed. What we see during the war is that all the time, like every day, literally, their supporters are on the street and they're asking their supporters not to leave the street because they want to create that atmosphere that we're still in charge, we're still in control, and they're arresting thousands and thousands of people on a daily basis. So all the signs when you're following, you don't see that, okay, now that Ali Khamenei is gone, we are going to have Mojtaba, who is going to be, because this is what some people said, Mojtaba is going to be the MBS Ben Salman of Iran. He's going to
a reformer. Modernizer.
This is not happening. This is first of all, we don't know if he's in what health condition he is in, because there's no audio and there's no video of him released yet, although he has given 2 statements. It's written statements, so we don't know if he's really in a state to lead the country. But this absent leader, even if he's there somehow leading the country, there is no sign, not even one, that the country is, leaning towards some reforms. It actually, all the signs we see so far is quite the opposite. And this is what people fear the most, that this is going to be a police state after this war.
And this is great disappointment too, because you'll remember in the first 8-minute long video on February the 28th, when the war began, when President Trump gave all of his reasons for going to war, was that he wanted Iranians to rise up after the bombing is done. He said, you can go and this will be your best chance in a generation to take control of your government. And that was echoed by Prime Minister the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. And again this week, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has been talking about, he was saying, well, it's hard, you can't just, bring about a revolution from the air. There has to be a ground component. That's in fact what he said last week. But he talked about there could be ground components, hence the speculation about, well, what kind of a ground component would that be? Would that be troops on the ground? Would that be an intelligence operation? But there'd always been this idea about President Trump saying, I'm coming to help the protesters, but he doesn't talk about that anymore. And so there's
Well, also, if you
great
then have peace
disappointment.
negotiations with the
You pointed out a very interesting and very important point, that it seems that even Israel, who was hell-bent on changing the regime in Iran, now has come to this realization that this is not that easy to do the regime change with an air campaign. So, and we see that in the opposition as well. They're right now saying that, well, that was not the goal from the very beginning, but that's not quite true, because they were saying that they aim for a regime change. So right now it's becoming more and more clear that although all the top officials, many top commanders have been killed in the airstrikes, the system is still in place and they are managing to control the people.
We mentioned the Strait of Hormuz. It doesn't seem that the Strait of Hormuz is closed for all nations shipping.
No.
Like, if you're a certain country, your ships might get through. You might be allowed through.
And Iranians are talking about charging countries right now from now on. They say that, well, this was our
Like a
right.
toll.
Yeah, we turned a blind eye to it for decades. Now our policy is going to change. We're going to set some toll, and we're going to ask every country that wants to pass through this strait, they need to pay us. So because they are looking for, they need some revenue in order to build what's been destroyed in Iran. And let's not forget that oil prices...
That's kind of Trumpian.
Yeah. And
Actually.
the oil prices have gone up, by 2 times, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And Iran is able to sell its oil to China still. And if they get some toll, and they're targeting the countries, and they're targeting Israel, and they're blocking the Strait of Hormuz. So for them so far, they think if this war finishes today, they can claim victory. Whether it's true or not, that's a different story.
It's such a reminder, if a reminder was needed, that as military planners will say, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And it has now gone from changing the regime in Iran to actually changing the military balance around this critical waterway, the Strait of Hormuz, and changing it in Iran's direction. They have shifted the battlefield.
And Trump's new deadline is 5 days from
Friday.
Monday. So it
Markets
leads us up.
close on Friday.
So basically, on Friday night, we'll have a very similar feel to Sunday night, basically.
I mean, he always gives these deadlines, 2-week deadline. Do you remember in 2025, he said, I'm going to take 2 weeks to think about what I should do on Iran. And then a day or so later, he then attacked Iran. So they're always notional. But it keeps the world on edge. And it's a very, very dangerous spring. For him to think that you could solve the Iran problem or even bring about talks for even a ceasefire in 5 days, again, it shows a fundamental misunderstanding, a failure to grasp the details of the confrontation that you have now not only dragged America into, but in fact, in terms of its impact, the countries around the world.
And Parham, just a closing thought from you. Presumably, if there is some kind of negotiation, whatever form that takes, in whatever third country it happens in, it won't just be about ending this shooting war. We'll be back to square one about a potential Iranian nuclear program again.
Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the current Iran's parliament speaker, said that during the 12-day war, the previous war, when all the top commanders were assassinated and killed on the day one of the war, he was the one who later said that took control, and he was the one in charge of the fight against Israel. So I wouldn't be surprised that he will be the person who is in charge at the moment, especially after Ali Larijani, the head of the Iranian Supreme National Security Council, was killed last Tuesday. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's the person who is in charge. And these are the people who are coming from the Revolutionary Guards. They're ideological. As you said, he's a pragmatist. However, he's been involved in the crackdown of protesters. So he's pragmatic, but with a Revolutionary Guard background. And these people, they do not want, they have the experience of fighting against Israel and the United States. And during the last period of war, 12-day war, he said that, yes, we were shocked and we were disoriented for the first 3 days, but we managed to retaliate. And as we were approaching day by day, we managed to target more and more targets in Israel. And when I see the pattern of this war right now, I see the same thing happening. Yes, Iran was a little bit, disoriented in the first few days or first few weeks of the war, but day after day, right now, we see that Israel is being targeted more and more and more and more countries in the region are being targeted because the missiles that Iranians shoot are way cheaper than Tomahawk missiles that need to defend the airspace and those countries.
So interesting. Parham, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Lyse, good to see you too.
Thanks. Good to join you, Adam and Parham.
Thank you.
Now, before I spoke to Parham and Lyse, I caught up with Faisal Islam, our economics editor, because we wanted to talk about what Rachel Reeves had told MPs in the House of Commons at lunchtime on Tuesday about the government's thinking about how to handle the economic turmoil triggered by the war. But actually, it ended up being a much wider-ranging conversation about how the whole world and, well, our brains might handle the economic turmoil. So here is my extended conversation with Faisal, which went off in all sorts of different directions, quite far beyond what Rachel Reeves said in Parliament. And Faisal is here. Hello, Faisal.
Hello.
Well, what a day for me to miss the turmoil in the global markets yesterday, but have things sort of stabilised a bit?
They have a bit today. They've sort of stabilised at that higher level. They're still very much you can see the consequences of the conflict of the past 3 weeks, but we don't have that sort of seesaw roller coaster. Whipsaw, I think is what people said. I think that's really a British
Don't know
phrase.
what a whipsaw is.
No, you hear it and you sort of assume you know what it means, and it's probably what it is.
I'll look it up while you're answering my next question, which is, into all of this, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, walks, giving a statement to Parliament at lunchtime. I suppose we can look at it on two levels. There's the kind of the detail of what she talked about, and then there's the bigger picture and some of the hints that she drops. Let's do the detail first of all.
Yeah.
There actually wasn't very much of that.
No. And if anyone was expecting some big announcement of some sort of bailout package, this was never the moment for that. There's a lot of sort of, let me take a step back. A lot of economic policy is about getting the nation on a psychiatrist's couch and kind of massaging, a sense of confidence in the normal times. But then in a time of crisis and potential multiple crises, as a government, you want to look like you're in control, in charge. And this is especially the case where you have a very fragile kind of series of systems in the economy, famously the petrol delivery system or the food supply, whatever. All these things are just in time and they rely on people staying relatively calm and normal. So I think that they are trying to, this is a big meta point here, they're trying to project.
I mean, I did ask about the detail, but that's fine.
No. Well, they're trying to project that, that they're across all of these complicated supply chains. And then there's a lot of talk about what might happen. And I think it's not scaremongering. It's a reasonable question to say, well, what would happen if this sustains for 3 months, if these prices sustain for 3 months? And then you do have a set of choices. So on the matter that I think is most sort of politically contentious and which sort of people at home will be kind of attuned to the most, which is what will happen with energy bills. The curious thing is nothing at all. In fact, they'll go down for the next 3 months, but everyone is understandably anticipating what happens come July. Again, even then there's a bit of a cushion because summer is when we use 7% of our energy. And so even in the sorts of scenarios that people are painting right now, with the gas price sort of staying where it is, you are looking at higher prices, but you're probably looking at an impact over summer of about £10-15 a month for an average household. Notable, but not the sorts of levels that we saw that caused disaster in 2022 and needed a massive bailout.
Although Rachel Reeves was actually quite critical of the old bailout, wasn't she, under the Tories?
Now, that was interesting because I frankly haven't heard... I did hear that argument privately last week. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so in trying to say what they might do in the future, they chose to really kind of give a good kicking, I would say, is a technical term, to what happened in 2022 in similar-ish circumstances. Now, to be clear, the gas price spiked twice as high, and so the problem was twice as big. But at that point, there was a universal limit put on typical household bills of £2,500. Of course, it varied based on how much gas you used. Now, but this is a really important point, because that meant if you used more gas, you essentially got more support.
Yeah, which means rich people benefited.
Yes. And what they have done, which I didn't know they were going to do, is they put a number on that, and they say the top 10%, the top 10% richest households got an average of £1,350 worth of support. And what she clearly communicated today, didn't quite say it, but it was clearly communicated, is you can forget it if those people are going to get any support this time round. Now, of course, that has been interpreted by, I know people in the conservative-leaning press are saying, well, middle-class people won't get this. And, we just don't know. It sort of depends on how much help might be needed. But a very, very, very clear steer from the Chancellor that whatever package emerges, if needed, will be targeted on those with the most need.
For example, like we've already seen with the help for heating oil, that's only for lower income households. That's not for everyone that uses oil to heat their home.
Yes. And I guess if you use that as an example, though, I think it probably is hyper targeted. It's pretty small, right? 53 million. There are plenty of people, I would say, who would never.
No, but it's not a blanket bailout for people.
No. You're right. But I think that the lesson or the signal from the heating oil support was that, that really is hyper targeted via council mechanisms to the very, very poorest identified households. It isn't even approaching being something that is, not forget universal, but it's not even anything that's particularly broad, right? That if they did that in the energy bills, faced with even a half the shock that we had, that would be quite a choice. Two things really, really interesting, I think. Firstly, she made that announcement with one eye on managing expectations of the public, but another eye pretty clearly on the markets that we have talked about.
Because she said over and over again, I'm going to stick to my fiscal rules, whatever happens.
Yes, and I think this may also reflect some angst about the reporting of a cabinet meeting last week. I think it was in the Times that suggested there was some chat around the cabinet table about, being more flexible around her famous rules that limit borrowing, so that we could afford a bigger support package for energy. And so they were keen to knock that on the head. So everything will be affordable in the existing rules. That suggests a few billion, not tens of billions. To go back to the original point, yes, she gave wasted money on richer households was the key phrase. I think there's a reasonable argument to say I'm not sure how much of that argument we heard at the time in September 2022.
Many people in other political parties were opposed to a universal.
I haven't gone through Hansard, to be honest, but I definitely don't have the sense that I can recall vividly people saying.
Well, of course, as Chris Mason always recalls, the day that Liz Truss announced her huge energy price guarantee is the day that the late Queen died.
Yes.
So not many people were paying attention to it.
Well, it was an incredibly important thing, but we didn't get
those 20s of billions of pounds that it cost.
Well, at that point, it was going to cost 80 billion.
Yeah.
It ended up costing 40 billion. But it didn't get on the news that night. But it obviously did hugely help limit inflation, even though it got to massive double digits. And it helped hugely save a lot of people. But now the government say that was wasted huge amounts of money, many billions of pounds. And they wanted to send that message to the markets, where there has been, across the world, there's been a sort of an issue with government debt. The effective interest rates being charged to governments, or all governments, but the UK has had a sort of special attention, I think it's fair to say, has gone up. And so that is a message that there won't be a sort of fiscally imprudent spending that she was clearly wanting to get out. And so that's a balancing act. So you can get there with the use of data. You can use things like social tariffs. You can operate it through the energy companies. They do have a bit of time, even with the forecasts that are coming through about what could happen in July. It's a lot, 1,900 for a typical household for their dual fuel bill. But to give some context, that energy price guarantee we just talked about, that came in at 2,500. Right. So, but, the general vibe was very interesting, I thought. I don't know, all this, like, we're going to hammer down on prices and price gouging and profiteering.
Well, because that was the point I was starting off on with the detail of what she announced today. The detail stuff that is actually happening now is all about powers for the Competition and Markets Authority to make sure that companies aren't ripping people off and using this war as an excuse.
It was an astonishing release, actually, to read through it, because it was all hammering down, cracking down on this thing. But in every sentence of this press release that I saw, there was a "if it's happening," where it might occur, if it transpires. Those
It's
are not
the fear of price gouging rather than price gouging itself.
Those are the direct quotes. So they haven't actually established that this is actually happening, right? I think that's important to say. Now, it's fair.
So it's about signalling whose side they're on.
Well, okay. Yeah. So the incredibly cynical, and occasionally journalists are cynical interpretation of this
Skeptical.
would be that this is entirely sort of vibes, marketing, we're on your side. I do think it's a bit more than that. There are some powers of inquiry and sunlight that the competition authorities can shine just by having access to the data, just by forcing these companies up and down the supply chain to report. It makes you think twice. You suddenly think you're going to be comparable. They have this fuel finder comparison website where you can check, and suddenly you're thinking, so that could act as a force for competition, where it's definitely true that in the past you have had some flab added when a wave of inflation has come in, and then it famously goes up like a rocket, these prices, and they come down like a feather. But then I also think that they're using what what the Americans call the bully pulpit, just to get inside the minds of these supply chains at every level. Are you absolutely sure you really want to? You put up the 5% that's your cost. You might put up 6% to account for something else, but if you're going to put up 10%, you might not get away with it. It is a sort of, again, a sort of psychological operation to get in the minds of the people in the supply chains, not to go too far to say we're watching. What they would actually do if they did it, now, from the sorts of words we're hearing, you'd think, they'd be getting the handcuffs out, maybe some knuckle dusters as well. I don't think that's what's happening. What's happening is like it's open data and shaming and pointing fingers. It's not fixing of prices, but there will be some new powers we hear for the Competition and Markets Authority. The great irony here, Adam, is this, which is just a year ago, these same authorities, the regulators, were being hauled over the coals, and indeed one of them got fired for being too tough on business.
Because they were stifling growth.
They were stifling growth. They weren't being sort of pro-growth enough. And now, and I think the government would argue, well, these things are not in conflict. But, really, the criticism was that they were too obsessed with consumers and consumerism and not helping, and the red tape that comes with that. This would seem to be a rather different emphasis to the emphasis that these regulators were forced to run with just last year.
I thought there was a very interesting intervention from Jeremy Hunt, the former Chancellor, who told Rachel Reeves to stop being so partisan in what she was saying, because she'd had quite a go at the Conservatives for being too gung-ho about the war in Iran, and she was making the case that, it's just because the UK is held back and being prudent that we're not involved in it, and that's a good thing. And he was saying, be careful about how partisan you are in your remarks, because you'll need cross-party support for if things get worse. I also wondered if that was him warning her not to rewrite history, because actually everybody was in favour of the energy price help the last time round. Also, I wonder if it was a message to the Tories as well to also be less partisan about this.
Yeah.
And a little bit more, let's act together in the national interest.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of priorities that change with the new reality that we face. And if you take a step back, we have energy prices that are higher and could be structurally higher for a few years. We have the issue around defence spending, how you make space for that. It was tough enough when the 10-year bond yield was closer to 4, it's now closer to 5. That's going to have an impact on interest rates if that sustains. So I think that's probably what he's talking about, a sort of consensus. I mean, she does have quite a lot of MPs, and probably difficult to imagine her needing to
relying on Tory votes. Yeah.
Well, but it is interesting. I mean, we've said this before, but it is just worth underlining where we are, which is there's a general consensus on something like the energy cap. Nobody's suggesting changing the energy cap. Everyone's accepted the fact that despite the fact that the underlying gas price has rocketed, everybody's gas bills should be cut. Nobody's suggesting that's stupid. Remember when it first was floated by one Ed Miliband as opposition leader 10 years ago.
At a Labour Party conference.
And, even
and people said it was Marxist.
People did, and then it was adopted by the Conservative Party, and now it's immovable. And then similarly, on, the first instinct when gas prices go up is now, even before they've actually, the rubber has hit the road in terms of bills, everyone's like, how can we prevent gas bills from
the
going
history
up?
of the energy price cap is fascinating, because I remember being at the Labour Party conference in Brighton, where it was the rabbit out of the hat in his leader's speech, because Ed Miliband, of course, was leader of Labour at that point. And yeah, the reaction was huge, and mostly quite negative, because people said the energy price cap would distort the market, and
the energy industry was just chucking quotes at us about how insane this was. And it's now a total,
the main tool we have.
unarguable fixture. And I don't think a single party would argue with what is a form of price fixing, which, right now, when you think about what would happen without it. Likewise, to go further than that, the idea that people should not face the inevitable consequence of rising global gas prices, that is now the consensus in Parliament, across party, is they shouldn't. Now, there may be a debate about the degree, but that's the reality.
On the energy price cap, we've had a question from newscaster Jenny, who says, can you tell me who's paying the extra cost of my energy? As I understand it, the government has capped my energy bill until June, July, but presumably somebody is paying the increased cost now. Is it the energy companies or the government/taxpayers?
That's a great question. So this cap, the normal cap, so we're talking specifically about this, it just smooths over the price, right, into 3-month blocks. So I think the answer is you will pay it in 3 months' time, but you won't have to pay it going up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. It will be sort of managed. Now, if it goes too high and you get some sort of bailout, like we had in 2022, and they then put an upper limit on where that should go, and that could be 2,500, like it was in 22, that's then the taxpayer or borrowed money, and it's probably you
to compensate the energy companies for the money we're not giving them as bill payers.
So that's into the future. Now the mechanism is eluding me. There was a very interesting mechanism of repayment, but yes, essentially.
I used to know that too, but I don't know it anymore.
Well, this is the 4-year-old policy, and it's not entirely clear that they would repeat anything quite like this, but a social tariff, which would normally have been put on bills for everybody, you would expect maybe would be funded from taxation, which in turn would be funded from borrowing, which in turn would be paid for by future taxpayers. Indeed, that was Rachel Reeves' argument today, was that we are now paying the bill for having, quote unquote, wasted the money on richer households. Another little detail here, which I always like, was because we have such bad insulation in British houses compared to, say, German houses, of the 40...
No, you said this last week.
Oh,
we
I
were
did.
hitting the air outside our house.
Yeah. Sorry.
We're using taxpayers'
I'm getting
money
old.
to heat the
I
air.
just started several
Well, no, it's
billion
still because
pounds.
it's lodged in my mind.
Several billion. Well, someone
Interesting
took it.
point.
Do you can do this with infrared cameras? You take pictures of houses and you see the heat leaching out. So yeah, sorry.
But to answer
digress.
Jenny's question in the very precise,
I'm trying to avoid answering it.
Well, no, because it's well, I mean, also Ofgem has got hundreds of pages on their website how the energy price cap is calculated. It's not a simple thing, and also the fact is, if you look back at the history of the energy price cap, it was originally a measure to encourage people to shop around for their energy bills, and if they hadn't shopped around to get the cheaper deal, it was to protect them from being overcharged. And it's only in the last few years of repeated energy crises that it's become a thing to limit people's bills in a more general population sense. But in terms of the reason it's going down in the next 3 months is nothing to do with energy markets or energy companies' profits. It's because the government has decided to take some of the so-called policy costs. That are basically the cost of government policy that comes to you via your electricity or gas bill. The government is taking them off and putting them into general taxation instead, so it's spread out across the population in a more progressive taxi way, as opposed to, and that's tax-esque, not taxi way, tax-esque way, rather than it going directly onto your bill. Jenny, thank you for your question about the price cap. So to sum up where we've got to with what Rachel Reeves said in the comments today, it's a few things. One, the focus today and the detail was about giving the regulators tools to make sure that there isn't going to be price gouging
Yeah.
and taking advantage of the consumer.
Which is
by
mainly a big
companies
megaphone,
Yeah.
a threat of a stick.
to tell them not to do it.
Yeah.
And then if there is going to be any support for high energy bills in future, that will be targeted, and Rachel Reeves will not borrow extra money, or certainly not borrow any more extra money to do it, that will bust her fiscal rules. And also, this might be a complete phantom, because actually there might not be an energy bills crisis in the autumn at all.
Yeah, I think the energy bill, yes, in their best case scenario. But I think it's understandable that people are looking at worst case scenarios. And I think if you wonder why, it's a reasonable argument. People will argue. We've seen this from different parts of the political spectrum, even potentially from an argument within cabinet. Why don't they just borrow the money? Why don't they just smooth over everybody's bills? Well, we are already seeing the consequences of concerns around where interest rates are going to go, concerns around the UK being a bit more inflation-y than other countries manifest themselves in the cost of government borrowing going up. Now, that's real. That will have a fiscal consequence if it sustains. This is exactly the sort of chasing your own tail that they're trying to avoid this year. Indeed, had we had the same system as last year of constantly assessing the borrowing rules, we'd be reporting every day now how your taxes are going to go up.
Yeah,
it's quite interesting.
Yeah, because the OBR didn't do that in the spring forecast, because Rachel Reeves said, no, you're only going to do that in the budget.
If they had done that, right now it'd be like 10 billion tax rise, 10 billion, again. So you can sort of see like that alternative universe, but you will see anybody that is involved in the housing market will see what's happening with the mortgage market. My colleague Kevin Peachy wrote a very interesting article that's doing very well on our website right now. There has been a significant reduction of the availability of mortgages as they just try and work out what is going on. Just like the Bank of England governor told me, we just have to hold to work out what's going on.
Yeah, and because the important thing about mortgages is the rates are not so much based on what the Bank of England base rate is, and they announced last week that they were holding that at 3.75%. It's actually more linked to the cost of long-term government borrowing, because that's basically how the banks get their money for your mortgage.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's the perfect way of explaining it. It gets a bit more complicated with something called swap rates, but we'll just park that for a minute. But essentially, that is correct, and you can see the consequences of that, right? So the average 5-year, 2-year fix is up about half a percentage point. Right now, they can't really price them, so many of the mortgages have been pulled as they try and work out. Now, this is really interesting. There is a massive disagreement out there amongst city folk about whether interest rates are going to go up.
Yeah, this is an interesting subplot from the last day or so.
Very, very interesting. And I feel like I can sort of... So what it is this. The markets, the people who who invest in government debt that effectively sets this interest rate, this market rate, it is implied that rates will go up 4 times it was yesterday morning, and now it's 2 to 3 times this year, which is a massive turnaround. That's what the markets are assuming. Economists have a different view. The people who sort of just look at exactly what each member of this 9-member committee tend to do and their arguments they make. And many of them, not all of them, are saying, in fact, we should expect a cut. So you have this big divergence about what they're going to do. I think I'm the one person that's actually spoken to the governor of the Bank of England in the past week. And I certainly got the impression. Well, no, I mean,
I know.
I try. It's just like decide for yourself. But he was like, it was almost channeling Theresa May with "hold means hold." Right? That's what he said. We don't know what's going on. But then he said something very interesting, and I don't think I'm overinterpreting this. He said, "Words to the effect of." An interest rate rise, monetary policy isn't going to open the Straits of Hormuz. So interest rate rise isn't going to open up the Straits. The issue here is the Straits are gummed up. So if you took that at face value as a signal, you're like, okay, this is not a guy going around with a sort of Arnold Schwarzenegger interest rate sort of gun saying, I'm going to fire these interest rates off to kind of calm down.
Yeah, because you would only put interest rates up if you thought there was a structural issue with the economy that was pushing prices up for a while. But if it's just a sort of accident of history that is a war, then actually that's not a permanent thing.
Could be.
And actually also if your war is then dampening economic activity, you need to encourage economic activity, which is what you do if you cut interest rates.
But this just goes to show. So, there's layers and layers of complexity, uncertainty, total randomness of like what on earth President Trump is going to tweet. The reality of the situation, is this 5-day pause I mean, literally, I mean, you've obviously been talking to your other guests about this. Is the 5-day pause a pathway towards peace and conflict stopping in some way, or is it a 5-day pause so they can get the Marines to go and invade the energy island and seize control, which is obviously a massive escalation? So is it absolute escalation to the levels we've never seen before in our lives, or is it in fact de-escalation? That's the meta level. And then you have everything in between. And then you have, is interest rates, in fact, they're definitely going up by 3 times. Oh no, they're going down. I mean, I try and help people navigate through this, but like you can see why, and in this, and I think this is really important, with this sheer randomness that we're seeing, accidents do happen. We don't know how some hedge fund, big hedge fund that we'd never heard of, suddenly becomes a household name next week because it was positioned a certain way in crude oil markets.
Or to go back to your point about energy companies hedging and sort of buying their energy in a way that means that they're not exposed to massive increases in the price. They might have mucked that up totally and they end up going bust.
Yeah, or they didn't expect that
built
to
out,
happen
but-
at the same time
Yeah.
as there were, normally these government debt, they do go up and they do go down, but it's very sort of, they go up slowly and they come down slowly. To see these random movements, the chances of an accident in the financial markets, it's kind of like I wouldn't discount that, and it's probably another reason, sort of, why we hear the questions are being raised, particularly in Washington.
And the definition of a whipsaw, in other than the financial markets, is a saw with a narrow blade and a handle at both ends, used typically by 2 people. Of course, it's that saw you see.
Oh, I thought it was something
Like
to
in
do
cartoons,
I
when
thought it was
things go
something to do with
horribly
the
wrong.
Indiana Jones whip and like a saw on the end of it, maybe, or something like that.
That would be a very
No, but that
scary
sounds-
but inefficient way of
But
chopping
would
wood.
accurately reflect the current state of the markets.
Yeah.
I think that would. You see, that sounds like
I'm-
controlled and organised, cooperative.
Yeah, because that's one person pushing and another person pulling and then swapping over.
I like my version of whipsaw, which is a saw at the end of a whip,
more like
which is
whiplash.
flailing around.
Yeah, because you're thinking of a whiplash, which would be a whip
Maybe.
with a saw on the end.
You have this thing though, don't you, where you have phrases you've used for ages, and you just realise when you're like in your 40s that you.
Reminds me of our favourite
misused
episode
it.
of Newscast you and I did, where we discussed whether it was wiggle room or wriggle room. Very little
Well,
of
it's
either
wiggle.
at the
It's
moment.
wiggle. It's wiggle.
Faisal, thank you.
No worries.